Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce our guest all the way from Madrid, Spain. He is an international speaker, trainer, and co-author of the book Team Topologies. Please welcome Manuel Pais.
Hi, everyone.
I'll stop sharing so that you can take over.
I can share. First of all, thanks for having me. It's nice. I think, as I said in a post, it would be nice to be there in Miami, since I've been at the airport in the layovers, but I've never visited. So, but since the current situation doesn't allow it, it's nice to be in touch in this way. Since we're a small group, I think we'll have more time for discussions and questions at the end. I think it's fine if you post a question in the chat, or if you want to speak out the question, even better after I do the presentation. So this talk started from seeing when this situation of working from home because of the pandemic and the lockdown started. I saw a lot of posts around how to get teams to work remotely and to keep the same kind of fluidity inside the teams. And obviously that's all super important, but it felt like everything was focused on from an internal team point of view. So I was wondering, and I've done some work around how different teams interact, and so how does this change, or what are some ways that we can make that easier for different teams to interact in this kind of fully distributed context of working from home. And so that's where this talk comes from. So to give you a very brief overview, I have a computer science background. I've been in the industry for about 20 years, and I've had different roles over the time. And then in the last 5-6 years, I've been working mostly as consultant around DevOps, continuous delivery as well. And because we often encountered problems around teams and interactions between teams, and how that kind of impeded a faster flow of work and delivery of software in particular. That's where conversations with my co-author, Matthew Skelton, with whom I was consulting, we had a lot of conversations about how the problems within teams were actually the bottlenecks to deliver faster with better quality, rather than focusing only on the tooling, which many organizations usually do, toolings or frameworks and this kind of thing. So that's kind of a little bit of my background. So when we're talking about remote work, I guess it's obvious probably for you that it's not really just Zoom and Slack, right? It's not really just about having tools that allow us to communicate asynchronously and remotely. So it's a lot more. But for some people who perhaps never had this experience of working remotely, they might realize for the first time that it's not just about the tools. And we're probably going to have new tools coming out and better ways of helping. We were just talking before we started about Miro and Mural, and these tools that allow us to do kind of whiteboarding and collaboration online that actually work quite well. And I expect there will be more. But in fact, there are other aspects we need to consider to actually make remote work effective. Right? I like to point out this example where you can see here on the left. This is actually from an email that was sent to people at the organization, and what they were trying to do was apply similar rules as they do in the office to this remote work. Asking people to respond within a few minutes to Slack or Hangouts, and essentially telling their manager every single step they're doing when they're working remotely. It's first of all not very realistic, and secondly, it's not very adequate to these times we're living, where we have to reconcile private life and work life, and everything is in the same space at home. And it's really not what you want to be focusing on. It's not about kind of shift and lift and try to apply the same rules in the virtual, in the distributed space as we do in the same office space. So there's something, I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but I just wanted to point out even studies from Google and other research that points out that actually you need psychological safety is factor number one for teams to be high performing, that people feel safe to take risks, to express their opinions without being worried around retaliation and those kind of ways of control over teams and individuals. So these are two very different approaches here on the left and here on the right. So I have a couple of references there that I think are useful if you want to know more about psychological safety. It's an example of kind of things that we need to be concerned about, especially in the distributed world where there's less face-to-face communication, where we need to be much more wary of what's happening and how other people are feeling. And so for me, remote working to be efficient is also about psychological safety and essentially agreeing on ground rules and the practices that we're going to adopt as teams and between different teams. And if you think about any kind of transformation, whatever it might be called in the organization, DevOps transformation, digital transformation, if you're already having some issues or struggles because there are issues around how different teams interact, when we move to this remote world, that's just gonna become even more evident. If there's some kind of us versus them mentality, that's gonna be even more predominant in a distributed world of working, where we don't even regularly see the other people who are in other teams. And so if we have poor remote interactions, that's going to get even worse typically if we don't do anything about it. And that's just going to kill or really make it that much more difficult to do any kind of meaningful transformation. So I'm the co-author of this book, Team Topologies, Organizing Business and Technology Teams for Fast Flow. So we're focusing on how do we get essentially patterns and heuristics for teams to set themselves up for fast flow. So this came out in last year in September. It's published by IT Revolution Press. So perhaps you're familiar with some of their books like The Phoenix Project, Accelerate, and other great books around this kind of intersection, if you like, of management and technology and agile and so on. So there are some ideas in Team Topologies. Obviously, it was not written for distributed world, was written in general for teams and organizations, whether they're the same office or distributed. There are some particular topics that are very useful to think about in this context. So this is what I'm going to cover today, starting with team dependencies. When we're talking about fast flow, and ideally we would like to have teams that are fully autonomous and independent, but I think it's, I guess everyone would agree that there are always some dependencies between teams, right? Even if we have this cross-functional autonomous teams, there doesn't mean they will be able to do all the work by themselves. So there's always some dependencies. Hopefully they're more, I call them soft dependencies, depending on other on capabilities that other teams might help us with, rather than depending on other teams to do part of the workflow that we need. But essentially, if we know we have dependencies, the first step would be obviously to make the work that we're doing as a team visible to others. So bringing, visualizing the work that we're doing. So since the organizers are Kanban experts and they give courses on Kanban, I'm sure this is obvious for them and for anyone who came has been in contact with Kanban. The first idea, or one of the key ideas, to visualize the work, right? So in this remote first context, that is a vital thing, to understand who or which team is working on what. So we know if we have a dependency on that team, when do we expect that to be ready, or that we can count on that team to provide us what we need. That's kind of a first step. So one way that we propose in the book to do that is with what we call a team API, which API means application programming interface. So perhaps a little bit geeky, but what we're trying to do is say, we need teams to have a very clear interface with other teams. If we can make it as easy as possible to understand how teams like to interact, how do I get information from that team? How do I find out what they're working on? If we make that as clear and straightforward as possible, that's going to reduce a lot of, it's going to reduce some problems. It's going to reduce the amount of effort it takes to promote good interactions between teams. And so this is quite easy, right? It's just for each team to decide, this is how we work. This is the kind of principles we follow and practices, and this is the way we like to interact with others. It's from the inside towards the outside, to make that clear to others how we work and interact with others as a team. And this needs to be actually work. It needs to be not just something we put on a page somewhere, but actually we promote and we make this, we publicize, or we advertise and evolve our team APIs by promoting it towards the teams around us, the teams we interact with, so that they know this is a way that we can make the interactions easier. So the kind of things we would see, expect to see in a team API, things like what are the artifacts that we own as a team. So that might be code, or might be other things that are not code. If it's code, then how do we version? How do we test this code? How do we review it, perhaps? Where is our documentation, examples, practices, and principles? So a lot of things that we can make clear for others. And it's interesting because it's really a matter of perspective. So we've had people who told us, yeah, when I think about it as this is team API is focused on helping other teams, not my team, then it changes the way they approach, and they find out, they'll actually realize that there's a lot of things that are not clear for others. They're clear inside the team, how we do it, but they're not clear for others outside the team. So the last 2 points are super important in this case of a remote context, where making the roadmap, or whatever you call it, or the backlog, or the work that's coming next for the team, making that visible to everyone in the organization, especially the teams around you. What are your priorities? How do you prefer to communicate, and when? What times of the day, asynchronous versus video calls or emails, etc. So we actually have a little Git repository. So github.com/team topologies. We have a number of simple tools and templates to help with some of these techniques. So you can see a team API is just a simple template around what kind of information should we expect to see there. So once we visualize, or we make clear what is the work we're doing as a team, so that others who depend on us can look into that and find the information, then we want to start tracking dependencies between teams, right? This is actually based on the original article from Spotify that originated the Spotify model, which according to Spotify engineers doesn't exist. But anyway, that's another discussion. But there were actually other techniques besides kind of the organization aspect. There were other techniques that were interesting in that paper. One is a very simple way to track dependencies between teams. A simple spreadsheet, obviously that is not the important thing, is not what kind of artifact, but just having a way to visualize which teams depend on which other teams, and also importantly, what type of dependencies are those? Are they kind of healthy, it's something that we can deal with, okay, it's not really impacting the flow of work or the quality of work? Or is there something blocking where, say, I depend on another team and I have to stop this feature or whatever work I'm doing, wait for the other team to do something and then come back to me? Those are the kinds of dependencies that increase the wait time and increase the lead time to deliver functionality or whatever, any kind of requests, change requests, etc. There are other ways, other techniques. So I'm guessing people are probably familiar with Dominica de Grandis because she did a lot of work around Kanban. She's now more focused on value streams. She's working at Tasktop. And she wrote this great book, also published by The Revolution Press, called Making Work Visible. And so some parts of that book are about how do you track dependencies between teams. And again, starting from the point of making those dependencies visible, and so that you can then address them. And so she talks about, if you have these boards with the work for each team, then you have some ways where you can identify that, some pieces of work depend on another team. And so you make that visible. So some of the techniques in her book might need some adaptation for the distributed world, but the concepts and the ideas are very valid. So I strongly recommend that book as well, if you want to dig deeper into this idea of making work visible and making dependencies visible. But so if we have different types of dependencies, we want to track them over time because we might have healthy dependencies that turn unhealthy and the other way around. If it's a healthy dependency, then we are fine with that. We can keep those. We just want to control or have an idea that it's not, kind of degenerating in something unhealthy. And we want to mitigate slow dependencies where perhaps we're not blocked, but it kind of slows us down because if we have more autonomy to do this piece of work, then we wouldn't depend on other teams. And blocking dependencies are the ones I mentioned where this actually directly affects delivery metrics and the flow of the work. So we want to try to eliminate those. One thing I want to point out is that when and in the book, our book Team Topologies, we talk about fast flow and autonomy in teams and reducing dependencies. That doesn't mean, that's a different thing from building networks. We still need networks inside the organizations, and in the kind of knowledge work that we do, informal networks are very important, and often work gets done by this informal, thanks in part to this informal connections rather than whatever is being said in the org chart, which typically doesn't fully communicate how teams interact and how they need to find solutions together and find people who can help them with certain problems. So make sure to have time and space for these kind of informal interactions, which are not perhaps even related to the work you're doing as teams, but just the kind of conversations you would have over in the kitchen when you're having a coffee break or over the water cooler. These are now more difficult. This won't happen naturally. So especially if you're a team lead, I would say to promote and incentivize your team members to actually book time with people from other teams, colleagues and friends, or people they want to get to know better that are not in their team, and that should be part of the workday as well, because these informal networks are going to be are likely to bring benefit in the medium to long term when you know who exists in the organization, what do they do, and their kind of competences. And if you have, for example, you're already running, many organizations run either lunchtime talks or even internal conferences on a regular basis. So for example, I gave a talk at SAP, the enterprise management software company, because they're distributed around the world, then they do these virtual meetups internally, and then they record it and everyone can access it, but they also get a lot of people to come together from different parts of the organization, and they actually get to know each other and talk about common problems they have and they never realized. So creating these informal networks and making sure we put the effort to keep those going is important, as we see that working from home is at least going to be still a strong part of our new normal, if you like, of the work environment for a long time. Another aspect I want to talk about is team boundaries. Essentially, teams understanding, with whom are they supposed to interact, how to get information that they need in this kind of remote world. So first of all, I want to talk a little bit about the idea that there are different trust levels depending on the size of the group that we belong to or that we're working in. So I don't know if people are familiar with Robin Dunbar. He's an anthropologist. He has done a lot of research around how groups of people form across different types of not just organizations, or not organizations in the workplace, but actually, like villages and tribes and this kind of different types of groups that form in the human world. And so with this research, he found actually humans are limited in the amount of meaningful relationships they can keep, or kind of their social network, where meaningful relationship means someone that at least we know their names, we know their role in the organization or in the group that we're part of, and we kind of have a kind of basic understanding of who this person is and how we relate to them. And so this number is typically between 100 and 200 individuals. So people often talk about Dunbar number as 150, kind of the average, but it's a range. But there is a limit on our capacity of keeping all these connections in our brain effectively, because our brains have a limited size. And so interestingly, he did recently similar research, but was actually looking at social networks on Facebook and so on. And he came up with similar numbers. Obviously, someone might have 600 friends on Facebook, but the actual meaningful connections are just a subset of, again, between 100 and 200. There is a very interesting example if you want to read a bit more about this. If you know this material Gore-Tex that is very used for hiking boots and hiking material, the company that produces is owned by a gentleman called W.L. Gore, and he always keeps, as this company grew, they always kept the size of the offices or the factories to 150 or a maximum 200 because of this this limitation. So that what happens if you grow beyond this limits is that people start seeing others as them. We have I understand my group of this 100 to 200, and when it grows beyond that, it feels like they're parts of the organization I don't know, I don't understand, I don't know what people are doing there, and so it creates this kind of us versus them mindset. There's a very interesting article also from Ben Ford, who was in the military in the UK, in the Navy, and then he became a software developer. And so he did also some comparison of Dunbar's numbers. So there are different limits. So there's that kind of 150, but there are other limits. Starting with 8 to 15 is kind of the limit of people we can trust deeply, that we can have very fluid relationship with, and almost guess what they're going to do, what they're going to say. And so that's typically the size of a team, right, in organizations. So that's an interesting article as well. So you can look at this in this kind of onion view, if you like. Like I said, 5 to 15, sorry, is kind of the team size. That makes sense. And then 150 is Dunbar's number, but also there's this 50 number which is, I guess, where you can have a group of teams with strong connections. So that might make sense as a kind of some guidance on how big should our business units be, or depends how you call it in your organization, but how many teams that need to work closely together around the same business outcomes, if you like. The key point is that the dynamics change when we cross these different boundaries. So we should not expect that people are going to behave and express themselves in the same way inside a team as if they're inside a group of 150 people or 500 people and so on. It's not a linear effect. So actually, I want to give an example. This is a case study that's in the book from a company called AutoTrader. Last time I gave this talk to a meetup in the US, they told me AutoTrader also existed in the US or exists. I'm not sure how popular or how much they're known. They're quite important in the UK or known in the UK. So they used to produce these publications around sales of cars, prices of cars, and use, and all this kind of things that I remember my father had a lot of those as well because he was really into cars. And when they moved to the digital world, they did very kind of deep changes in the way they were organized. So one of the things that they did is they had this big building for their office. They said on each floor we're going to have one kind of business area. So all the teams that work in this business area are going to sit together on the same floor. And this promotes that it's very easy for those teams to interact, right? Because don't have to, actually studies that show even if you just have to go up one set of stairs, one staircase, it's already going to cause a lot more people not to go and talk directly to other people, and they're going to email or something. So what they're trying to do is say, even if you have, for example, marketing, sales, and legal, perhaps teams and technology teams, they're all sitting on the same floor. So we promote those kind of good interactions where we want those teams to exchange information easily when they need to. And so this is an example in the physical world. And when we are looking at the virtual world and we're having tools like Slack or Microsoft Teams or whatever you use, how does this translate, right? How do we make sense of this idea of putting teams that are strongly related together or not? So probably a starting point is that if we just have one giant Slack, for example, one giant virtual space where we put everyone, that's probably not a good way to go about it, especially if we are working organizations of more than 150 people, 300, 500, 1,000, you name it. We need a bit more structured way to organize our virtual space so that we don't have people who are feeling lost and they actually don't know to whom and where, which channels they need to respond to, where do they find information that they need, who do they need to talk to. Because this huge virtual space starts to feel like, I don't belong here, or I don't know where I actually belong because of those Dunbar number limitation. They have a lot. They start having feeling like they're not together with the other people. They don't know the other people in this big virtual space. There's a lot of noise and not enough direction. So perhaps in thinking about the AutoTrader example, we might make sense that we have a Slack or a virtual tool instance or workspace for limited to that 100 to 200 people, and hopefully aligned with business areas as well. So in the case of AutoTrader, I don't know if they've done this actually. I should ask them, but I would expect that it would make sense that they have different Slacks for each of those different areas that you want to promote strong interaction, collaboration between the teams inside that area, but not necessarily across the whole company. And so when you go one step further and you look at one of these Slack workspaces, then obviously we want to pay some attention how we organize the channels or the different spaces. You would expect in most organizations that each team has their own space so they can, talk fluidly, and unless they prefer not to, and just do permanent video call or whatever it might be. But if they want to have a Slack space for synchronous communication, they should have one for the team, obviously. But then we can also think about what other channels would be helpful to promote the good types of interactions between different teams. So imagine in this example, we're using the kind of the parlance of Team Topologies book. But imagine they have a stream team one that's collaborating with a platform team around some monitoring service. Let's say we're developing this service that's going to help the stream teams monitor their services better. So it probably makes sense to have a channel for that. It's going to be a temporary channel while that work is going on. But we know, the two teams know that when they need to talk to each other asynchronously, probably this is the right place. And here on the top right, you can also see if I have a team that's doing support for other teams. For example, if I have a logging service and I support all the teams that use this service, then probably makes sense to have a channel for any requests for help or incidents and so on. We want to make sure that it's clear and it's easy for teams to find out where they're supposed to communicate, especially between when they're interacting with other teams. Obviously, at an individual level, you see here, Mary, we want people to identify, with their photo, hopefully their name and their role and the team they belong to. So it's easy for us to know with whom they're talking to, and make that identification of who this person is and how they relate to me easier and faster. As I said, in this example, I was using the parlance, the topologies from the book. So these are the 4 types of teams we talk about. And so that's what you saw there. But it doesn't need, you don't need to use this terminology in the organization to apply these ideas, right? You can just replace with whatever makes sense, or the names of the teams, or the type of the application team for a specific service, whatever it might be. What we're really trying to do is have some team-focused conventions that help us. So these are just ideas. It doesn't mean that you need that you should adopt this directly, but some ideas that can help you think about what are some useful conventions to reduce the effort for different teams to interact. Because if we have these conventions in place, this increases the discoverability and actually reduces the effort or the cognitive load on inter-team communications. And then we want the interactions to have meaning, to be purposeful, and that we don't kind of waste, if you like. So there is one myth, which is in part, I wouldn't say promoted, but it came about sometimes from the DevOps movement, the idea that we should expect all teams to collaborate with each other. But that's just not possible. We cannot expect to talk to everyone else in the organization or every team to talk to every other team. So what we actually need is much more well-defined interactions. So we know if we're interacting with this other team, what is the purpose, what is the duration, and what are we trying to achieve in this interaction. So we talk about 3 specific interaction modes in the book. So collaboration, this is going to be very, very brief, but collaboration essentially is 2 teams working together to solve some problem or find a solution. X as a service is typically where one team provides a service to another team who consumes it, and we actually expect that there isn't much interaction going on. If the service is easy to understand, it fits the purpose of the teams that are consuming, it should be straightforward to use. And the third mode is facilitating, where one team helps another gain knowledge or gain better understanding of some domain. All of this, well, I should say collaboration and facilitating should have a specific time frame. How long do we expect to be interacting in this mode, and what for? What's the purpose? And when we have the topologies I mentioned and the interaction modes, we can also have a very useful kind of tool, which is we can have a snapshot of our organization or part of our organization, where we can see which kind of teams do we have, how are they interacting, what are we trying to achieve. So this is just an example of such a snapshot where we see, oh, there's a platform team providing some services to streamline teams, or cross-functional teams, if you like, would be the most, I guess, the most common term. There's some differences, but I'm not going to describe that today. And we can see there is some collaboration going on between a complicated subsystem team and a streamlined team. And there's an enabling team that's facilitating some knowledge, perhaps around test automation or something. It's just a snapshot that allows us to see what's going on today, what are we trying to achieve, and then we can look at what are the future states, or where do we expect that we need to go next. Perhaps we need a new platform service to help around data APIs, making data easier to use and retrieve by different teams. Maybe we need help in around continuous delivery domain or DevOps or whatever it might be. So remember the team API I mentioned before. One thing that can be included in the team API, or it could be separate, but it would make sense in the team API, is to clarify our current interactions with other teams. So this is an example. Let's say we have Streamline Team 1, and they might have in their team API specifying right now we're interacting with, first of all, with the test automation enabling team, a team that's helping us understand how to do test automation, how to manage test data for iOS, for example, because we need to develop an app for iOS, which is something new, and we don't have that knowledge. And we're specifying, we expect this to take 3 weeks, 2 hours per day, where we're going to be working together with this other team. And we, at the same time, there's another interaction going on where we're also interacting with the complicated subsystem team that works on a face recognition module or subsystem. And we're collaborating with them to define some workflows and some response errors for some situations. And we expect this to go on for 2 months, 1 day per week, where we're going to be together and discuss, how do we find what's the adequate workflow, response errors, and things like that. So it doesn't mean that this duration is going to be precise. We're really good at underestimating, right? But at least we have an idea what we think we need for how long. And then, if it goes way beyond what we expected, we can reason about it and see, is it because, let's say, we just underestimated and we needed 3 months, not 2 months? Or is it because we were trying to help the team understand test automation, but they actually have other gaps that we need to address first. So we're trying to kind of help them with this specific thing, but they don't have the background, they don't have other concepts that they need to be able to do that. Basically we're using any awkwardness in these team interactions in the sense that it didn't turn out as planned as a way to sense that we need to evolve. Actually, this team needs more help in this domain, or this team would be really able to do more if there was a service that helped them do monitoring or deployments faster, so that they don't have to worry about that every time. This kind of assessments that help us evolve the organization and evolve the teams that in order to be able to do the work faster and deliver faster. Another kind of myth is, as I alluded to earlier, looking at the org chart as defining the communication path in between different teams. If you look at an org chart, typically it's something like this, right? With nice boxes and vertical lines between boxes. And the org chart can be quite useful for sometimes for compliance, for reporting, hopefully for aligning the work of the teams with the kind of strategic objectives of the company. But it's not a good representation of the communication lines, the actual communication lines in the organization. As I mentioned before, it's much more of a network approach that we need for many complex problems that we have. We need teams to reach out to other teams and other people to find solutions or help them solve problems that they're having. And so we need to have this clear, and unfortunately in some situations people are actually forced to follow the organization chart in how they communicate, but that's not effective. I like this this illustrations from a book called Team of Teams that I highly recommend. It's from a general in the US, where he's talking about how in the war in Iraq again, the war against Al-Qaeda, they realized that the military in the US were organized like here in the left, very hierarchical, decision-making, communication, and what they were facing is a much more distributed network of cells and more distributed asynchronous communication. And so they had to change to become more of a network. And it's kind of similar in organizations. So we should let the real needs and that teams feel drive the interactions, drive the need for interactions rather than formal processes or the decisions that were made around the organization chart. Another way to see it is that if we let the kind of usually HR or design decisions or senior management decisions impose how we communicate between different teams, that's going to actually reduce our capacity to make good decisions and to find the solutions that we need for the problems that we have. So a bad example from Justin Garrison, he shared this last year that he had a manager actually tell him he couldn't have lunch with his friends because they were on the dev team and he was on the ops team, and the manager didn't want communication to happen between teams that wasn't going through him. So this is the perfect example of what not to do, not use the org chart as some kind of power game that we try to play by enforcing communication lines around the org chart. And finally, we want to clarify the communication purpose and the channels between different teams. So another simple template we have on github.com/team topologies is especially for teams that provide services to others. So we call this platform teams. You probably want to clarify things like, which services are we providing? How do they work? How do I know the current status of this service? Things like this. What are the details around the service to make this clear for everyone else? And the communication channels might be different, especially for this type of teams, around what type of request is being made. If it's reporting an incident, some service is not available, then probably the channels are going to be either by phone or Slack or whatever, but are the channels that probably going to have a quick response, right? And for other types of communication, interaction, or asking for support or feedback, then we might have other channels for the same team. The key is to make this visible and easy to find by other teams. And finally, I know I've been going on for about 50 minutes. I'm almost finishing. One last thing I would expect this is something you all realize, but just to make sure to point out that we need more than ever to have good feedback, right? And feedback, constructive feedback, something's actually a skill that we have to grow in our teams and in our people. It's not something that is a given. And especially in a remote context, we probably need to promote more occasions for giving feedback and helping people give constructive feedback. Again, especially when they're not face-to-face, when communication perhaps doesn't involve even videos, emails, or surveys, or whatever you might be using. So we have to be careful and kind of grow and help grow these skills of constructive and actionable feedback. There's a very quick example that I like to give. So Twilio, which is the US company, their platform team that provides services to other teams for building and deploying and running their services. I think every quarter, or perhaps it's even more frequently, they send out this survey to all their kind of internal clients, the teams that use the platform, to ask, how well does it help you do your job, do your builds, deployments, do you feel like the platform is compelling, that it's getting better, that it's you have the right tools, and that we listen to your feedback and help improve the platform so it's fits your need better. So this is something very simple that you can do as an example of proactively asking for feedback and making sure we keep those communication lines and feedback lines working. And finally, the last small piece of advice is that some things are going to work in your organization, some things are not. And so you have to try, keep what works, what doesn't, pivot or try something else, and see, you're going to have to grow this understanding of how you can improve the interactions between teams. Hopefully, with today's example, you have some food for thought, at least. But this is always going to be a work in progress. I wanted to mention we also are working kind of based on this talk and expanding on this. We're working on a free workbook for remote teams with more examples and worksheets. This should come out in hopefully this month in June. It's also going to be published by T Revolution Press, but it's going to be a free PDF essentially that you can download. We have, so I mentioned different aspects of team topologies and even the interaction modes. We have, besides the book, we have training that goes into a lot more detail around that. So all our training now is online, is all half days, 4 hours. So I wanted to mention, because actually tomorrow I'm starting the kind of series of 4 different courses in June. So every Thursday, my afternoon, so that's 8:30 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. For you. So if you're interested, you still have time to join tomorrow at 8:30 a.m. So the website is teamtopologies.com/events if you want to have a look. We also realized that with the current situation, a lot of people have been affected. They don't have possibility to pay for their companies. Either companies have frozen their training budget, or people are in layoff, unfortunately. And so we have a discount code that essentially the price becomes, if you apply this code, instead of 300 euros, then it's 96 euros for people who are having this kind of problems, but are still interested. And in general, we have a number of free resources. If you have a look at teamtopologies.com/remote first, and the GitHub repositories I mentioned are just simple tools and templates that hopefully can help if you're looking to try out some of these ideas. I went a bit longer than than I meant, but I'm happy to stay longer for questions. Thank you for listening. In any case, and I hope it was useful.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you very much, Manuel. We do have a couple of questions. First question here is from Michael, and he's wondering, how does a Spotify model function within your shown model?
That's an interesting question. So in our trainings, I explained this in more detail, but the Spotify model is, first of all, the people at Spotify have said that it wasn't the model, it was kind of the way they were organized at that time. And actually, there's been recently an article that kind of debunked some of the ideas in that original article. But anyway, I think it has been useful for organizations that were working in a very functional, siloed way, to actually start thinking about cross-functional teams and start thinking also about enablement of teams and helping them gain the competence that they need with guilds and these kind of structures. What we're talking about is having organizations that are much more fluid, where the team structures change much more dynamically. So I like to compare it to more of a living organism that is always evolving rather than a fixed structure. So Spotify model is kind of the way people interpret it is a static model where we expect this to be a kind of end state where, oh, if we're organized like this, then everything's going to be better. And it helps in some ways, but it's kind of limited because the type of problems and the evolution of both on the technology side and on the market side and things like the current pandemic that for many organizations kind of made them change their business model very quickly. We need teams to be able to adapt much faster. And so the topologies are just types of teams that we can then instantiate, if you like, and say we have these teams who are of this type and we have these other teams who are of this other type. Obviously today I couldn't detail the different topologies. That's actually the point of the course tomorrow and next week. But in a nutshell, the streamlined teams would be the cross-functional teams that deliver value to the end customers, and the other teams help them reduce their cognitive load. So help them with gaining knowledge, help them providing self-service capabilities that they need, so they can focus more on the business aspects. So this is called the germane cognitive load, which is focused on the business rather than spending a lot of time learning how to automate deployments, how to install monitoring tools, all these kind of things that are actually not directly related to the business value. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Mike, do you have anything you would like to elaborate on that?
I'm not a strong Spotify practitioner. I know there's a company out there called Coveros as well that's doing it, and they're pretty limber, meaning they are rather small. They're based in, I believe, well, they're actually distributed pre-COVID-19, totally distributed workforce, and have been pretty successful changing around. They do a lot of quality engineering workshops like DevOps East, DevOps West, or I should say Star East, Stars West, DevOps conferences. And what I've heard from them is that they're able to do it pretty fast. But I understand how at least the Spotify side of it might be a little bit rigid. So I'm curious, what companies, Manuel, do follow the interactions that you have with your team topologies right now? Maybe just the ones you were bringing up, but are there other good examples like in the US?
So in the book, we have a number of case studies where we see different organizations applying some of these patterns, especially like the platform pattern, the enabling teams pattern. What we're doing right now, as we talk to people in organizations, talk to us, and with some clients that are applying these ideas, is to have examples. So if you, on our website, teamtopologies.com, you have some industry examples that we're collecting. So I'm actually talking right now to a few kind of bigger companies to see what they've been doing, but I can't yet disclose that. Hopefully, hopefully this month they will publish some more. But yeah, we'll be updating the website with new cases. What basically when Team Topologies came out, we saw this pattern working kind of in isolation in some organizations, and we brought together these patterns in a kind of coherent way. And now you see some organizations that want to apply this more holistically, if you like.
Nice, thank you. Michael had another question, and how do you associate an enterprise organization with Conway's Law? That you ship products based on how you are organized?
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting point. So we talk a lot about Conway's Law in the book and also in the training tomorrow. So if anyone is not familiar with Conway's Law, this talks about the mirroring effect between our team structures and the design of the systems we're producing. And essentially saying we might create a great design for our services, our systems, but if the teams are not aligned with that design in terms of aligning the teams with the parts of the software and the communication structures, then what we're going to get in the end is going to look much more like the team structures than the actual design we had for the system. So in another way to look at that is that if we have a rigid structure for our teams, we are limiting ourselves in what kind of solutions we can find for our technical systems. And so it's not obviously one-to-one mapping. It doesn't look exactly the same, but it's kind of a force that pulls the systems away from what we wanted because we didn't align the team structures with those systems. So in general, kind of good practices today, or if you think about microservices or this kind of architectures, are where we try to decouple different parts of the system and have them communicate more synchronously. And that kind of correlates to how if we want that kind of architecture because it has certain advantages for developing complex systems, then we will expect our teams to also map to that in a way. So having teams that are more decoupled in the sense that they're able to do their work more autonomously with less dependencies on other teams, and they have this more synchronous interactions. So the interactions are not to do the work itself, is to gain capabilities, typically. Conway's Law is very interesting because you can also apply that to other. There was an article recently about Conway's Law and deployment pipelines, and where they were looking at actually what we get in the deployment pipelines is a reflection of all the different teams that are involved. And so perhaps there are many more steps because each team has their own steps. So it's kind of that mirroring effect as well there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I worked for several banking institutions, and the applications they built internally and even externally were definitely a reflection of their rigid nature and reporting structure. So should be interesting though to see how COVID and all this virtualization is impacting and influencing the next generation of applications. The applications that are in design now, how are we taking into consideration that they need to be more collaborative, like the Miros and the Murals in the world?
Yeah, I agree. I would expect at least to be a change in understanding of this, because as I was saying, and especially people in the same office, there's this kind of expectation that everyone can just collaborate with everyone else to get things done. And even in the same office, that's not how it works in practice. But since we're now distributed, I hope there will be more acknowledgement that we need to have more structured way to how teams should interact or not, and how to make that easier and clear.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, something that I read in your book that's a little bit controversial, maybe to some, and that is that you don't necessarily need to, like you said earlier in your presentation, you don't necessarily need to communicate more. If you have a well-running system and everybody has the expectations or what to expect, right? Then that's enough.
Yeah, exactly.
And so if teams are feeding other teams enough, then we don't need to push that collaboration and communication, right? Is there a point where teams can feel like they don't have to push that communication and collaboration topic anymore? That, you know, what's a healthy point to make that transition?
I don't know. I'm not sure there would be a kind of explicit transition, but if our starting point is that we want a faster flow, we want to be able to deliver faster and to be more competitive and all these things, which is kind of the starting point, then we want teams to be more autonomous, so that we know. And there's research I didn't mention in this talk, but if you know about the book Accelerate and the State of DevOps reports that have been coming out, there's significant research showing that, you know, high performing teams have less dependencies on other teams. So it's because they're able to do the work themselves and they have the skills and capabilities to do the work themselves. Often the problem with that is that organizations think that it's just about giving autonomy to the teams, and that's not exactly true. You need to give them the competences as well and the tools. But so if we want teams who are more autonomous, typically you will see, you know, them having less and less dependencies on other teams, on other experts outside the team to do parts of the work. And so I think that kind of naturally then, as the team grows in maturity, if you like, and competence, then gradually the need for interactions with other teams is decreasing, which is not to say that we shouldn't promote informal communication and that they're valuable informal networks. But if we want fast delivery and fast flow, then we want those autonomous teams and reduced interactions. We talk about inflow interactions and out of flow. We want to reduce the inflow interactions, or kind of hard dependencies, where say, for this flow of work, I need to stop and wait for the other team. That's what we want to avoid. But we still have dependencies in terms of, I would like help from this other team to understand test automation, or to provide a service that helps me create test environments, or helps me deploy automatically without taking so much time from us as a team.
Great, thank you. And Carl has a interesting question here. And how do you see team topologies changing at the executive leadership level in growing companies?
That is a very interesting question, which we also get frequently or in different shapes. So essentially, it's what we see is that if we have these topologies, we have teams that are more autonomous, you start having management, or at least the kind of middle management role changing to more kind of cross-boundary. So the role of middle management can then be looking at this interaction, looking at how we need to evolve the teams, and what do we need to do to improve on that, rather than looking inside each team. It's actually looking at the interaction between different teams and trying to help them, you know, move in the right direction. So that's one aspect, kind of that middle management layer. But there are other aspects, and if we're, you know, those autonomous teams, they need to be aligned to some stream of work and to some business area. That's another thing. If we have kind of the IT department separate from the business department, then you have, you know, also issues of having autonomy, because those teams in technology cannot decide what they need to do, or they cannot run their own experiments easily, because there's always this kind of translation between the business part and the IT part. So there are kind of more fundamental changes that you would expect at the business level to make this more effectively. The interesting thing with team topologies that we've heard from different people is you can start, or the entry point can be at different levels, can be at the individual team level, clarifying their team APIs, clarifying how they like to work and interact with others, or can be, we've had examples in, not very large organizations, but the actual senior managers are deciding to fundamentally rethink how they organize teams with team topologies. But you can have different entry points, and obviously for large organizations, it's not going to be as easy to make some of these changes, but it's definitely possible.
So making more team decisions based on the services that you offer, rather than like a org structure, a traditional org structure.
Yes, so part of it is having the teams having more autonomy to make decisions. And if you've heard about this kind of movement, if you like, of moving from project orientation to product orientation, it's all about moving away from the idea that we're always delivering projects and outputs, where we are coordinating different teams to get these outputs at some specific date. And we're moving to product orientation, where we fund kind of value streams for the business, or business value streams. And inside the business value streams, you might have different products, and you might have different teams working on different parts of the product. So this kind of alignment from starting from the product and the value stream, rather than starting on let's create projects and do work. We have these value streams, and we need to fund the teams that are working along this value stream, so they can evolve the product as they see fit, obviously with business people together.
Okay, great, thank you.
There's a book, I'm always talking about IT revolution books, but a book called like that, From Project to Product, by Mick Kirsten, which is quite, it's all about that, because it's actually quite difficult for an organization that is project-based to move to product orientation. There's a lot of things that need to change.
That's a great book. This is Michael Doherty, and I haven't read all of it. I've scanned through it, and I'm a big SAFe teacher. I've been teaching SAFe for over 3 years, and Dean Leffingwell decided to become buddies with Mick, and he's going to be speaking at the European SAFe Summit next week, which I'm actually going to. Means I have to get up at like 2 a.m.
Oh no!
to attend it virtually, since I'm not actually flying out there. It's a virtual summit, but they're doing it. I don't know what time zone you call it. MEST, whatever that time zone is. So
okay.
It's a really fantastic book, also about common language, right? That if you're talking to accounting, you got to talk in the accounting way they understand. Marketing, you got to talk in the way they understand. Sales, talk in the way they understand. Some are more difficult than others. So that's a real fabulous way to do it, and it takes a lot of learning. I did want to ask one other question, because I am a SAFe trainer. I've also kind of drank a lot of the Leffingwell liquor, and not that I am like live or die by SAFe. I'm far from that. I'm as both Travis and Sandra would attest, I do a lot of other things too, but they've had in the latest one this idea of networks within hierarchies. So you got a big organization, big old fat Fortune 1000, and then you build networks within the hierarchies. And then those networks are usually agile release trains, which are kind of following that Dunbar limit. I was wondering if you knew about it, and what are your thoughts about that approach that Scaled Agile recommends?
I don't know a lot about SAFe. I know kind of the basic ideas. You do get a lot of people in the trainings who have been, the organizations have implemented SAFe, and they've come across some issues, and they want to look at different ways to combine with SAFe to be more fluid, I guess. but I don't have enough kind of knowledge around SAFe to answer. But it sounds like makes sense. So I don't know. Obviously, you can correct me. It feels like SAFe still relies a lot on people's roles, and what we talk about in team topologies is very much focused on teams and team autonomy and the team first approach, which is also not easy to achieve. We're not saying that this is something you get from one day to another, but if we want fast flow, then we need to have that.
Yeah, they play a very interesting dance within Scaled Agile and why they are the most popular scaling framework out there, between reassuring middle management that they aren't going to be fired and saying that
The way to put
there
it.
are changes that will need to happen within your company to make this real. And that balance, of course, is one of those where they've said, well, you may have to change it, and roles do matter. And all of the power of the teams and the teams of teams, and how to make that happen is you build your domes on doing it, and you do your innovation centers, following the concepts of Jeffrey Moore and a lot of his ideas of planning, the horizons of products as they get built from, incubation to decommission. And as well as Cotter's book on Accelerate, which is where you want to get innovation going and start doing things new and be a disruptor within your own company. Build these networks in your old-fashioned standard hierarchies, because hierarchies often are associated with bureaucracies, which are associated with wasted work, which are associated with bad organizations. So there is that concept that's in there. But again, SAFe kind of plays an interesting dance, because sometimes if you take it very religiously, you would cut out a lot of those roles out there or move them around. They have to learn, right, to do things differently to make it work. That's a pregnant pause.
Yes. Anyone else has any questions? Daryl?
Yeah, I
there
have
you
a
go.
quick question about the book. Is the book more tailored to software development and the teams around that, or is it a general team topology?
It's focused on software delivery.
Mm-hmm.
What has happened is that in different people and organizations have told us that they think it's applicable beyond software delivery, because if you look at it, the patterns are kind of more generic than software delivery, and they might apply in other areas. So we're actually in contact with a few examples, one from a government agency in the UK, where they actually want to try to apply these patterns in a non-software delivery, because they say this gives them some structure that they were lacking, without being very prescriptive in terms you need to have these teams and these roles, but it gives them a kind of structure to, we need this type of teams who should be focused on this type of providing this type of service, and this in this kind of way, because team topology is a lot about expectations essentially from teams and interactions, so that we can do the work more effectively. So we hope to publish some examples around that throughout the year as these organizations apply some of these patterns.
Check out the book.
Great.
Yeah, it's really good. And us actually from the book, and Manuel, correct me if I'm wrong, but you can actually, you don't have to, it's like a step-by-step, but you don't have to use it all. You just take it as you need it, right? You take different references and different approaches depending on your organization.
Yeah, if you, it's actually not very thick, so you can, if you read it from beginning to end, you probably get the most value. But definitely, it was meant as, you can consult and look at the parts that are more
It's like a
relevant
reference. It's like a reference book. So great. This is good. Any other questions? So a lot of reading. Manuel also has a really good LinkedIn course on DevOps, and he talks way beyond even the book and this talk, and it's highly recommended. So if you have the time, check it out as well.
Thank you, Sandra. Yeah, I'll focus on continuous delivery for enterprises.
Mm-hmm. Well,
That's
wonderful.
great. Thank you, everybody. Be sure to check out the book, Team Topologies. Also, look into attending one of Manuel's classes. Very informative and a great model for the team interactions that we've got going on now and the changes that are taking place. So thank you, Manuel, for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Thank you so
and
much.
for inviting me.
Thank you. And make sure we're we're already planning our next meetup for June 24th, and it's all about OKRs. It's objective and key results. So make sure to join us. And of course, we have our classes coming up. We have our Team Kanban practitioner in Saturday, June 27th, and we have our what we call the KMP 1 and 2 coming up on June 20th, 21st, and then KMP 2 on July 11th and 12th. So again, I'll look out for our next meetup. I mean, OKRs are great, and we're actually going to do like a Jeopardy fun game. So we'll make it fun, not so boring. So look out for that. And again, thank you so much, Manuel. I know it's late. You're calling us from Spain. So thank you again, and everyone, thank you so much for attending today.
Hey, one real final question, Manuel.
Yes, please.
Sure.
This is not totally related to your topic, but I'm actually in the process of writing a book myself. And I was just wondering if I could connect with you like in LinkedIn, and if you'd be willing to give me any tips on the publishing or the marketing of the book. That would be really helpful. I'm doing it with someone else as well. And we're still kind of early. We don't plan to publish the end of the year, but when we get to that point where we're looking like we're going to have something that's publishable, I'd love to have any feedback you give on any sort of tips.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that because we were fortunate with IT Revolution, and we've learned a lot. Tip number one: don't wait. Get a publisher first, but contact me and yeah, I know, but it's
Okay.
It makes sense. But yeah, anyone feel free to contact me or connect on LinkedIn or Twitter or through for Team Topologies. We also have Twitter account and LinkedIn. So if you want to keep up to date, then yeah, or ask any questions later. No problem.
Thank you.
Well,
Great.
thanks, and thanks for hosting.
Great. Thank you very much, everybody. You guys have a great evening, and we'll see you at the next meetup.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Good evening.